On Christmas night, I saw my son drop a grain of white powder into the glass meant for me. I didn't scream. I switched the two glasses, snapped a photo, set a napkin to preserve the fingerprint. Max looked at me as if to remind me, don't let anger mix into the wine. Tonight, the truth will stand still on the silver tray. Do you dare stay until the very end? A thin wash of yellow light poured onto Elias's eyes long accustomed to endurance, the deep grooves at their corners like cracks in winter wood. His pupils reflected a trembling streak of light from the porch, flickering and then easing like a breath trying to stay even. His eyelids opened and closed slowly, not from drowsiness, but as if a person were trying to settle a subsurface wave back to the bottom. Something had passed through him, leaving a fine, dark halo like soot along his cheekbone. It was not noisy, but heavy and real, like the smell of cold iron on rainy nights. His right hand traced the ridge of Max's back. The coat of the old German shepherd in his season of age had grown thick, shot with silver strands that glinted under the lamp, dry and warm like a sweater left too long to dry by the hearth. The tendons stood out over Elias's knuckles, moving so slowly they were nearly still, each stroke another way to steady his heartbeat. Max lifted his head just enough, asking for nothing, only pressing his chin to the back of the hand so his warm breath could mingle with the smell of oiled wood and old fabric in the room. In Max's clouding eyes, there was a kind of composure people often lose when they have to live beside things that still have no name. Elias touched the faint scar along the dog's ear remnant of an old storm season, then drew his hand back as if afraid of stirring a cry. With his other hand, deft and quiet, he set two polished wine glasses on the table. The glass gave off a very small sound, thin as a spoon touching the rim of a cup in some far-off kitchen. Rings of light moved across the wooden tabletop as he rotated the stems, catching even the glint from the Christmas tree in the corner. He had rubbed the shine until not a single smudge remained, revealing the discreet satisfaction of a craftsman who has returned a surface to its proper silence. In that instant, resentment felt like a thorn under the skin, not visible, but tightening that last wipe. He paused for half a second, eased the pressure, and let the cloth return to its rightful task, to clean, not to erase. A slim draft nosed through the door crack, just enough to make the scented candle on the shelf waver. Cinnamon and dried apple drifted through and then sank away. A silver-framed photo hung on the wall. Martha smiling on a summer lawn, her dress rumpled by the wind. The photo stood still, but Elias's shoulders sank by a small degree, as if the picture had just added an unseen depth to the room. He reached to straighten the edge of the tablecloth, smoothing a stray crease. Everything needed to lie in its right place, the way unfinished sentences need to lie in their rightful portion of silence. When the two glasses sat parallel, their stems spaced at a distance measured by a practiced eye, a brief spark of hope lit in Elias. Perhaps symmetry could, for a while, keep the remaining layers of waves still. Max shifted his paws under the table, a dry click of claw on floor. He watched the movement of his master's hands, as if following a ritual by heart, wipe turn set pause. Elias answered, with a nod almost too small to see. He did not speak. He let the objects give voice for him, the faint ring of glass, the whisper of cloth across wood, the steady breathing of the old dog. At the window's edge, a thin film of mist gathered, and outside, the porch light blinked a streak and then steadied. That flicker, returning at uneven intervals, told him about things that wavered not only in the wiring, but in the way people were slowly moving away from one another. He stepped back to take in the two glasses. His palm still held the coolness of the glass, seeping slowly into the knuckles, creeping up the wrist like a question. Strangely, in that moment, a faint shiver of satisfaction passed through him. The feeling of someone who has drawn a straight line across a tabletop, scored with scratches. The discreet pleasure of discipline imposed upon chaos. Then it went out at once, leaving behind an empty, cold ground, like a lake's surface freezing over again after a pebble has sunk. The wall clock notched a long beat. Elias pressed 2 fingers to the root of his nose, breathed slowly, and measured the distance between the pulses. When he lowered his hand, he fixed his gaze on the bowl of the glass, a clear, curved surface, clean enough to return the image of the porch roof outside intact. In the reflection, his silhouette split in two by a stuttering filament, stitched and then broken, stitched and then broken. He did not look away. The feeling of betrayal was not a knife, but a sewing needle piercing stitch by stitch, even prolonged and hard to name. Max pressed his head to Elias's calf again, a warm weight pulling him away from the wavering image in the glass. He stroked the dog's nape lightly, as if signing a compact of silence. What can be said with the hands should not be handed to the mouth. What can be arranged with objects should not force the heart to speak. He inched the 2 glasses closer, rebalancing their distance from the table's edge, as if tuning his own heartbeat upon the wood. In the trembling light, the room promised nothing beyond the honesty of surfaces. Wood is wood, glass is glass, fur is fur. Yet between the objects, something fragile still slid through, the wish for a quiet evening, even if quiet only within the small boundary he could control. When Elias touched a fingertip to a glass stem one last time and drew it back, leaving a chill trace that evaporated quickly, he felt as if he had set down on the table not only 2 glasses, but the remainder of a winter that had lasted inside him. Behind him, the kitchen breathed softly. Before him, the empty space on the chair waited to be filled. And in between, he stood still, back straight, eyes a little bright, with a brightness hard to tell apart. Hope, or only the reflection of glass. This is the last Christmas I will spend on my son. At least that's what I thought, until I witnessed something horrifying. I said that line in my head before letting it out as breath. My voice sounded so small it touched only the inside of my chest and dissolved. At this age, I no longer try to make anyone believe. I only try to keep the things in the house still in their places. The porch light burning steadily, Martha's picture frame not tilted, the tablecloth smoothed flat, the 2 polished wine glasses set at a familiar distance from each other. People think Christmas is strings of lights and wrapping paper, but to me it is the distances measured again by eye and by heart. If you measure right, the night will be quiet, and the hard things to say will know to lower their own voices. Winter closed the way into the wooden house with the smell of oiled wood, cinnamon, and dried apples. In the photo on the wall, Martha was still young, chin slightly raised, her eyes looking out beyond the frame as if she were searching for a better seat for dinner. I had replaced the porch bulb at noon. It blinked once before behaving. I understand some things must be replaced before they ruin the evening. I also know there are things that cannot be replaced. The crack in a person's voice when he calls me father, for instance. That crack is never a straight line. It threads along the grain, loops when it meets a nail head, scrapes against memory and chips away. Hurt, if it had a shape, would probably resemble the fine powder a carpenter dusts over a tabletop before sanding. It makes everything feel smooth to the touch, but under slanting light, you can still see the dust hanging, touching not the skin, but tunneling into the lungs. I have lived through many winters like that, learned to open doors more gently, set a cup down more softly, and hold my anger the way one holds a brimming glass. If you don't want it to spill, don't move fast. Resentment no longer flares into flame. It is only a stubborn dark corner in the heart that shifts now and then, reminding me that unjust things came through here and left a trace. Even so, each time I set 2 glasses on the silver tray, I still feel a thread as thin as filament draw across my chest, fragile hope, the kind that doesn't dare speak its name, for fear that, once named, it will vanish like smoke. Perhaps if the room is bright enough and orderly enough, people will soften toward one another a little, sparing the day a sentence that would scratch the holiday. Perhaps if I pour the wine slowly and meet his eyes for just one beat, we will get through dinner without leaving another mark. I used to believe the fiercest storms had passed, that betrayal belonged to younger people, to old friends, to the first year spent scrambling to make a living. I didn't think it still knew the way home at year's end, shoes wet, leaving a thin track of mud across the wooden floor. People tend to be careless there. They think they have shut every door that can be shut, while the thing that needs guarding sits right on the table, out in the open, clean, and easy to touch. And then, in the quiet, I tried to build with tablecloth, with light, with dustless surfaces. There would pass through me for a moment the small pleasure of a person who has controlled an evening down to each detail, the pleasure of disciplined beating disorder. It goes as quickly as the faint ring of glass, leaving behind a cold emptiness. I know that cold. It doesn't seep from a poorly sealed window, but from the absence of a child's call to a parent, something that ought to be as natural as breathing. Christmas, if stripped of that naturalness, is only sheets of wrapping paper arranged in the right colors. I still choose to speak by gesture. When angry, I wipe one more round, arrange one more time, step back half a pace. When I want to forgive, I fill the glass, but do not push it toward anyone. I believe in small signs, the porch light holding steady, the steps ceasing to creak, an empty chair that does not make the person opposite fear being compared. I believe in Max. He is the only thing in this house that doesn't need to make promises and still keeps his word. Max does not ask why I am silent. He rests his head on my hand at the moment my hand is about to drop. He does that now. The silvered muzzle touches my wrist, not calling out, only placing a light weight toward the heart. I look down and see his eyes, a little clouded but calm. From that look, I learned how to stand still before what is coming, like a doorkeeper who holds no weapon, only a lamp. If anything is out of place tonight, I will set it back with the very things that made this house. Orderliness, just enough warmth, and a silence that knows how to keep boundaries. As for what lies beyond my hands, I entrust it to time. This Christmas, I do not chase miracles. I only want the room to know how to breathe evenly, the brief ring when a spoon touches a glass, and the porch light that does not flicker. The rest, if there is horror, will reveal itself under the light. And I will stand here with my hand on Max's head, as if laying it on an old pledge. Whatever happens, I will let the things that are true speak for me. Max rubs his head lightly against my hand, a nudge just enough to pull my heart back into its rightful place. I hear myself breathing, hear the house breathing, and hear the night close like a door that has just been oiled. Wide shot, the wooden house lies still beneath the cold early evening mist. The square window frames are like gentle eyes, each pane giving off the just enough warmth of yellow light, and a gas stove already turned off. Outside, the wooden porch runs in a long band, that band split into small segments by the conical light that keeps blinking on and off, like an eyelid that refuses to shut. Old snow has drifted into thin strips along the steps. Faint, straight-lined footprints lead from the yard to the door like punctuation marks already setting the night's breath. The camera pans slowly across the frontage, the house number plaque darkened by years, the mailbox slit curved slightly like an old smile, the white painted doorframe worn at the corners, the eaves caught with cobweb strands as fine as thread. Each time the porch light flares, all those details pop. When it goes out, everything retreats into a soft half-dark, leaving a feeling poised on the line between sure and unsure. Inside the house, through the glass, a figure is moving, solid, slow but without hesitation. Cut to close-up. A wooden step stool is pulled directly beneath the porch light. The seat is glossy from years of sitting. One leg bears a pale scuff. Elias sets his hand on the stool's back to test its steadiness, then places the toe of his shoe on the first step. The wood makes a small thock. He climbs one more step, his body blocking half the doorway. The porch light blinks again, swiping a white streak across his cheekbone and the bridge of his nose, then dies. Wind from the yard slips through, puffing his coat like a sail already lowered. Close on the hand, the knuckle joints stand out, fine blue veins running along the wrist. Elias touches the frosted plastic shade, coated with fine gray dust. He twists lightly. The shade turns free with a small squeal like a hinge needing oil. Dust rises, hanging as a bright streak in the cold air. His breath comes out as vapor, brushes the dust and dissolves. At the edge of the frame, the old bulb trembles on its threads, its filament a yellowed heart like a coal about to go out. The camera eases back half a beat. Inside, on the shelf by the door, a polished silver tray reflects the porch and the hand that is turning. Two wine glasses stand inverted to dry, their rims tossing back the flashes in time with the blinking light. Martha's photo in a silver frame tilts 2 degrees off the wall. In the picture, a lock of her hair is lifted by the wind, her eyes looking past the frame as if counting the porch's flashes. Under the nearby table, Max lies curled, his ears pricking slightly whenever the wood sounds. Back to the close-up on the hand. Elias tilts his wrist, grips the plastic base of the old bulb between thumb and forefinger, and turns counterclockwise. A dry rasp. The bulb budges, then agrees to turn. Once free of the socket, it cools quickly, leaving a chill ring seeping into the webs of his fingers. He lowers the old bee, and with the other hand brings up from his coat pocket a small cardboard box. The lid pops. Inside is a new bulb wrapped in thin paper. The paper rustles, revealing clear glass, the bulb's heart a pale green. That clarity in the erratic flicker feels like a new assurance wrapped in fragility. The camera follows Elias's hand as he seats the new bulb in the socket. His fingertips find the groove, one full turn, then another half. A very soft click. He pauses, steps back half a pace on the stool to take in the whole. The switch on the wall near the door is still in the on position. For one heartbeat, nothing happens. The next beat, the bulb blooms with a clear yellow and holds. No flicker, no testing, no bargaining, only light. The frame widens further. The new light lays a thin sheet over the wooden porch, bringing out every grain and every scuff from the winter before. Small droplets gathered along the eaves glint, then fall, breaking into very soft plops on the railing. The yellow spills onto the shoulders of Elias's coat, making the old seam look newly stitched. He is still standing on the stool, head slightly bowed, eyes measuring the intensity like a craftsman weighing thread. Inside, Max pushes himself up, comes closer to the door, nose touches the glass, breathing a round, misted spot. Cut to a close shot, Elias's hand strokes along the rim of the shade, wiping the remaining dust, then sets the shade back in its old place. A light snap, everything fits flush. He tightens the shade screw a little, a small screwdriver already drawn from his pocket. The movements are neither dawdling nor rushed, a rhythm trained by years of repairing more than buying new. The light doesn't change even as he shifts. It holds fast like a silent promise. Back to wide. Elias steps down from the stool. When his foot meets the floor, the wood sounds round and warm. He folds the stool and props it by the wall. The porch now shines evenly. The narrow lane beyond the yard stretches like a flow of ice, sprinkled with a few golden specks from far neighbors' houses. Through the glass, the room behind him lies smooth. The tablecloth lies flat to the edge. The silver tray is clean. The two wine glasses stand waiting. Martha's photo has been straightened. Everything like a little stage whose general lighting has just been set for a dress rehearsal. The camera glides over the threshold inward. The porch's new light slips past the curtain's edge, alights on Max's back and moves with his breathing. On the table, an old camera rests neatly. Dark leather strap reflecting a long bar of porch light. In the kitchen corner, the kettle cools, its side bearing the prints of the fingers that held it earlier. There is no excess sound, only the inaudible hum of the bulb and the quiet warmth of a house that has restored its own order. Final close on Elias's hand. He touches the switch lightly with index and middle fingers as confirmation, then lets go. The light remains steady. He glances over his shoulder at the porch, unconsciously straightening his back by a beat. The frame freezes there, a cozy wooden house, a porch light that has stopped blinking, and a man who has just completed a small but exact task, like laying a cornerstone for the evening ahead. On the floor, Max turns his head toward the table, curls up, leaving a space just large enough for a pair of shoes to come to rest in their rightful place. Everything has to be perfect. The lights, the moldings, even Martha's old photographs on the shelf. I'm trying to bring everything back to the way it was. I told myself that as I stood on the threshold of the living room, watching the new light from the porch spread in like a thin yellow cloth laid evenly over the wood, the ceiling light inside was turned down one notch so the darkness would have room to breathe. I made a very slow circuit along the wall where the molding meets the ceiling. My fingertips slid over the seams of old paint to make sure no hairline crack had begun to speak. In the corner, the wooden-cased clock ticked each small beat, as even as a sewing machine. I listened, then straightened the frame beneath it so the bottom edge sat flush with the guideline on the wall. A rightness only I would notice. On the shelf, Martha's photos were set in a receding row. A sun-soaked picnic, one at the kitchen window with flowers smudging the apron, one by the Christmas tree with flecks of lights in her eyes. I breathed a fog onto the glass and used the hem of my shirt to wipe away the faint whorls left by stray touches. The porch light fell across, pausing on the cheekbone in the photo so that she seemed to turn her head slightly. I shifted the frame a millimeter, then put it back. Some things, if placed right, will keep watch over the room for you. I smoothed the cloth on the coffee table in the middle of the room. My fingers pressed along the weave until there wasn't a single ripple of air left trying to run beneath it. On the tabletop, the silver tray I'd polished since morning reflected the ceiling like a still lake. The two wine glasses stood upright, their rims dry and taut, so clean that every blink of mine threw a shadow in them. I set the corkscrew beside them and gave the little hinge a test twist. It clicked just right enough to say, "I'm ready." Not louder than necessary. In the kitchen, the cotton towel hung over the back of a chair, folded in two, edge aligned to edge. I took a white paper napkin from the drawer, folded it into quarters, and creased the fold straight with the edge of my fingernail, the habit of a person who likes to see fold lines meet cleanly. I laid it on the tray on the other side of the corkscrew, a small white square among the glossy surfaces, to wipe any spilled wine if it happened, or to wipe away a fingerprint when it appeared where it shouldn't. Small things like that helped the night slip less. I stepped across the threshold and tested it with my heel. No more creak. The door hinges had been oiled since afternoon. The knob turned in silence. I touched the porch light switch, on and then off, just to know that the light obeyed. The feeling when an object dutifully does its part, that is the only peace I can supply myself right now. Back in the living room, I stood on the rug. The two chairs on either side of the coffee table were like two banks of a conversation that hadn't crossed the river in a long time. I took the back of the left chair and pulled it a half handspan closer to the table. The legs skated a dry sound across the wood and stopped. I went to the other side and repeated the motion, but a touch less, to create the sense that the person sitting there was being invited to step first. The distance between the chairs was now just enough for knees not to touch, but for breaths to touch if both would sit up straight. I canted one chair slightly, setting a small angle toward the silver tray, a silent signal. Tonight, we looked toward the same plane. Max slid out from under the table, brushed his back against my trouser leg, then curled again into the cool shadow beneath the chair. I reached out and set my palm on the bridge of his nose, taking in the steady warmth flowing into my skin. He didn't ask why the chairs had to be this close. He only lay where he could see both me and the door, like an old sentry who has never left his post. I lit a candle on the shelf, not for scent, only to see the fine shadows it would cast on the molding. The small flame raised the guidelines like ruled marks. I feel at ease when everything has a path to follow. From a drawer, I took an old matchstick and laid it across the mouth of the salt and pepper jar on the dining table, a marker meaningless to others but meaningful to me. If someone's hand touches it, I will know. Not because I want to spy, but because I need a wordless language to read my own room. I returned to the two glasses. My hand rested on the stem of the right-hand glass for half a beat longer, a kind of greeting before the evening began. For an instant, a cold prickle of pleasure ran under my skin, the pleasure of someone who has set everything exactly according to an order only he knows. It passed quickly, leaving a layer of emptiness right behind. I understand that emptiness, not for lack of people, but because there are distances only those who have loved each other can create, and only they know how to hush them. I stepped back 3 paces and took in the whole. Martha's photo catching just enough light, the silver tray quiet, the napkin folded square like a measure, the candle steady, the molding dustless, and the 2 chairs newly drawn closer. The room looked like a small stage before the curtain rises, each prop already on its chalk mark. I thought, if anything is out of place tonight, at least it will stand out against this rightness, like a stray note dropped onto a slow score. I am not waiting for a miracle. I only set back up what can be set. Light that holds, a flat tabletop, chairs drawn near but not forced tight. The rest I leave to how people choose to sit down upright or turned half away. I laid my hand on the back of one chair once more and pressed it to sit flush with the floor. In the tray's reflection, I saw my silhouette split by the rim of a glass. The 2 images overlapped as I leaned toward the opposite chair. I understood that that was where I would sit, and the seat across was where I was inviting someone to sit, not to win or lose, but to hear what needs saying in a voice just enough. The porch light streamed through the glass door, drawing a thin yellow band between the 2 chairs. I left that band as it was, like a delicate border one can step over if one wishes. Then I switched off one auxiliary lamp, straightened my cuff, and stood still so the room could memorize its new order. When I turned away, Max raised his head to follow, and the 2 chairs stayed where they were, closer by a little, like 2 people who have agreed to try talking once more. The door sprang open with a blade of cold wind, cutting through the house's warmth like a wet chalk line. The newly replaced porch light held steady above the door frame, pouring a yellow streak onto the sun's shoulders, clear enough to show the fine raindrops beating on the wool fibers of his coat. On the threshold, 2 forced smiles. Lips curved, but the corners of the eyes not in time. The polite expression of people stepping into a carefully arranged room and not yet knowing where they should stand. Their wet coats hung heavy, the smell of rain-soaked wool and weather mixed with cheap soap, making a chill that moved with them into the room. Water ran along the hems and pattered onto the mat before the door, revealing a path, a string of dark dots leading deeper into the light. The daughter-in-law ran her fingers through her hair, smoothing in a hurry, rain scattering into fine specks. The tangled hair settled on the shoulder of a pale knit sweater. The son reshaped his cuff, the motion rounder than necessary, like turning a screw in the air to keep his hands in check. Inside, the tree stood close by the window, the small string lights jerking their glow into islands of gold. The glass baubles reflected the porch into countless curved streaks. Each time someone moved, the streaks shifted slightly, like a night sky being touched. The 2 children slipped from their mother's hands like little streams finding a slope. Wool caps fell, scarves slid from necks, rubber soles tapped the wood in round beats. They ran circles around the tree, tiny shadows pooling on the wall. Their laughter sprang light as soap bubbles, bursting in a continuous transparent chain. That laughter, as it skimmed across the center table, touched the silver tray and the 2 upright wine glasses and turned into a very slight tremor on the metal surface. From that angle, the noisy joy of children thinned into a slender bell note, then dissolved into the air. On the shelf, Martha's photo caught the moving gleam. The corner of her mouth in the picture seemed half a tone brighter. Under the table, Max lifted his head, one ear raised higher than the other, without leaving his spot. He only drew a long breath, nose misting, then set his chin on his forepaws, eyes wide as if tracking the wind's direction. Elias stepped out of the kitchen's dark, his hands still carrying the metallic smell of the screwdriver, the dry hem of his coat brushing the table's edge. He stopped at the rug's border, close enough to hear the drip from their coat hems, far enough that the 2 chairs he had just drawn together wouldn't be knocked askew. The porch light slid over his shoulder and joined the candle on the shelf to lay a warm layer across his brow. He reached out to take their coats, touching no skin, only fabric precise, economical, like a librarian handing over and receiving old books. The water-heavy coats, once off their shoulders, suddenly felt light in his hands, leaving a cold trace on his skin that crept into the bone. The son glanced at the coffee table, his gaze pausing on the two chairs pulled nearer. His pupils checked for a brief beat, like someone who has just recognized a road sign. The daughter-in-law looked down at the rug, the toe of her shoe tipping to avoid a wet patch, and in that instant her wrist drew in slightly, clutching the small purse to her chest. It was all nothing more than extra detail for a rainy evening, but within the room's arrangement, these things stood out like pebbles, showing their heads when the water draws back. The children kept up their circle around the tree, small fingers touching the tinsel, giving a bell a gentle shake. The jingle joined the wall clock's beat to make a thin music. One of them stopped, having seen inside a glass bauble a tiny man holding coats, a curled dog, and lights shattered into stars. It burst out laughing, the laugh breaking into two clear pieces, then ran on. The third shard of the laugh fell onto the silver tray, where Elias's face reflected warped, cut by the rim of a glass. No one said much. Any greetings, if there were any, melted into the faintest hiss of the freshly oiled hinge, into the steady drip from the newly hung coats, into the warm breath of a room that had just dodged a gust. Elias hung the coats on the hooks by the door, spacing them by eye. The hems didn't touch the floor, and the distance between the two was just enough that they wouldn't stick together as they dried. He set the children's small boots in the rug's corner, leaving a straight path to the table, a path broken by the tree's shadow like a sentence with a clause inserted. From beneath the table, Max shifted his weight quietly, his long body casting shadow across half the rug. His eyes followed the adult's feet, not from fear nor curiosity, only as if taking notes. The room welcomed more people, but did not grow loud. Layers of warm and cold stacked up, the warmth underneath, the cold strewn across the surfaces of things that had just come in from the rain. The two chairs kept their new distance, like two blank squares on graph paper, waiting for words. When the children's laughter had made enough rounds, it settled into panting breaths, hot and guileless. In the quiet that just opened between two bursts of laughter, you could hear the house's heartbeat, the clock, the porch light's inaudible hum, the dry paper napkin leaning against the silver tray. The adults stood there, shoulders forward, chests back, each finding a point on the wall to look at. Nothing was wrong, nothing was right yet either. There was only a rainy evening shaped back into form by steady light and the order of objects, and at the center of the frame the door drew shut, leaving on the porch the smell of rain still clinging to the wooden step. Elias carried the tray out from the kitchen, the heat from the roast fogging the cabinet glass in a brief film that then dissolved, leaving the smell of browned butter and thyme mingled with the warmth of wood. He set a wooden trivet in the middle of the table, placed the tray down, its edge flush with an imaginary line running across the tabletop. Next came a bowl of mashed potatoes, a ribbon of melted butter drawing a soft, bright line, a plate of green beans tossed with fried shallots, the shallots as fine as threads of golden paper, a basket of dinner rolls, still warm, wrapped in a checked cloth, a small plate of pickles, their pale green standing beside the brown of the wood like a footnote. Each time a dish was set down, Elias stepped back half a pace, his eyes measuring distances, his hand nudging a serving spoon to the right angle for an easy grasp. The vapor rising from the table stirred the candle on the shelf, the shadow of the molding quivering fine as a string lightly touched. The room held the warmth of food just out of the oven, but between the threads of steam there was a thin, taut stillness, the kind of silence one hears with the skin. The clock kept time. The wet squeak of the children's shoes had stopped. What remained was the drip from the hoods of the newly hung coats and Max's even breathing under the table. The daughter-in-law stood angled by the chair back, one hand tugging the edge of the tablecloth, a pretend helping gesture when in truth she only needed to keep her hands occupied. Her gaze skimmed the tabletop like a bird that didn't dare land, sliding off the silver tray, sliding off the wine glasses, sliding off Elias's sleeve, then changing course toward the Christmas tree, where the small lights were safer to look at. Each time her eyes were about to meet his, she tilted her head the slightest bit, lashes folding down to hide some flash that had just flared. Her thumb and forefinger rested on the crossbody purse strap, tightening once, releasing, then tightening again like the rhythm of turning a ring one isn't wearing. Elias set the cutlery in place, knife blade facing inward, fork aligned with the grain of the wood. He adjusted the porcelain coaster under the wine glass, a small circle like an anchor to keep the glass steady on a slick plane. The quarter-folded napkin lay beside it, its crease sharp as a chalk line. He didn't look at anyone for more than a beat. His eyes chose objects the way one chooses words, setting them into a sentence with just enough meaning. The aroma of the finished roast soaked into the air, spreading an easy warmth. But on another register of the nose, there remained damp wool and rainy wind, not fully faded, clinging to the paths of those who had just crossed the threshold. Max shifted under the table. His body brushed the table leg, and the silver tray on top gave a slight tremor, a very fine vibration, passing through the two glasses and going still. From his throat came a low growl, not long and aimed at no one, only like current running through a wire, signaling that something had slipped a notch. His ears didn't stand all the way up, his eyes fixed on the space between the two chairs that had been pulled closer, where the porch light fell into a thin yellow band. Elias reached down and touched the fur at the nape of his neck. The growl subsided into deeper breathing. The sun stood by the window frame, tugging at his cuff for the third time. He glanced outside, where the porch now shone steadily without blinking, then turned back, his eyes passing over the chairs set closer than usual. He edged his heel half a centimeter, as if searching for a stance that took no one's space. The movement made the wooden floor voice a small hush, like a reminder, be gentle. The daughter-in-law drew a small handkerchief from her coat pocket and dabbed at the corner of an eye where there were no tears. She gave herself a small nod, then bent to pull out a chair, her eyes still avoiding Elias. Seated, she placed her purse on her lap, fingers never leaving the strap. On the table, the objects reflected warped curves, each person a fragment overlapping with the movements of candle and porch light. In those reflections, her furtive look was like a streak of shadow racing past, refusing to hold still. Elias spooned potatoes into a bowl enough for a first helping and set the bowl at the place opposite him. He poured a ribbon of glossy brown gravy, stopping exactly before it reached the rim, then wiped the extra drop with the corner of a napkin. He turned the bread basket so the opening of the cloth faced her chair, an unspoken courtesy. He did these things with the patience of someone who believes in small order. If the details are honest with one another, perhaps the human heart will lie less. The tree shed a single needle, falling onto the rug without a sound. The children sat on the rug nearby, absorbed in an empty ornament box. Their whispers moved like wind, threading a curtain. In that layer of sound, utensils touched plates in polite intervals. No one reached over anyone else. No one rushed their words. The air seemed warm, but across the straight-set objects, an invisible wire stretched taut over the table. Brush it, and it would ring high, long, and unpleasant. For the first time, the daughter-in-law looked straight at Elias as he tilted the wine bottle to check its level. Her gaze held for exactly half a beat, then slid off, catching on Martha's photo on the shelf. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her fingers, without thinking, brushed away an imaginary speck of dust from a fold of her dress. The posture shifted the small purse on her lap to one side, the zipper throwing a brief glint and going dark. Max lifted his head to that glint, his breath stopping for a fraction, then evening out again. Elias drew the bowl of beans closer and sprinkled on more fried shallots just a little, like adding words into the empty part of a sentence. He laid the spoon crosswise over the bowl, its handle pointing toward the middle of the table, an implicit invitation. Outside, the porch light still held steady, the yellow stripe on the floor unmoving. The candle no longer flickered. The flame kept the shape of a water droplet, calm as a sleeping eye. It all looked like a peaceful dinner, if not for the tiniest things. The daughter-in-law's blink arriving late, Max's just audible growl, and glances that skimmed past one another without staying. Elias sat back straight, his hand resting beside the square-folded napkin. He set two fingers to the rim of the wine glass, not lifting it, only feeling the chill of the glass run into his skin. The room's silence then was like a lake just after the wind has stopped, so flat that a single pebble would be enough to show the widening rings. He knew. At some point, something would fall into this surface. But for now, he only kept setting out the dishes, keeping the surface smooth, and listened to Max's breathing at his feet, a faithful weather gauge for the gusts to come. The clink of the spoon against the bowl's rim rang out in fine, even notes, like a rain shower slipping through old corrugated tin. Heat from the roast still rose lightly, curling into the candlelight in thin ribbons. On the silver tray, the metal surface reflected the room in a warped curve, where figures were bent slightly at the waist, and fingers became streaks of light and shadow running back and forth. Elias stood a little askew, his eyes seeming inattentive on the edge of the tablecloth, but in the reflection's margin he held another point of sight, a corner of motion that did not belong to dinner. The sun's hand appeared in that distorted frame like a fish breaking through still water, gliding fast, hardly touching the air. The cuff was dry, blue veins showed at the wrist, and between two knuckles, just before that hand entered the band of shadow, a thin white slip appeared, no larger than half a postage stamp, folded flat, its edge serrated. It was not a napkin, it was not salt. It was something that had no place on a table like this. The spoon's rhythm increasingly hid the small sounds. As a child giggled at making a bell on the tree jingle, that other fingertip had already slid the white packet down to the tray's edge, using the metal lip itself as a fulcrum for the other hand to take hold. A very slight flick, the serrated edge sprang open, and the powder inside showed itself like a tiny cloud of mist that had overslept. The faint snick was so small that, if not for the candle's minute pop of a wick fleck, it might have vanished without a trace. The wine glass set for Elias, its stem resting on the coaster he had aligned with the grain stood still at the tray's edge. In the bowl of the glass, the deep red lay quiet like the surface of a just ripened fruit, thin at the lip, thick at the base, throwing a dark crimson arc onto the ceiling. That hand tilted the packet at a pre-calculated angle. The packet's mouth formed a small funnel, the white falling like first snow dusted across the back of an apple. It touched the surface of the wine and vanished almost at once, leaving only a faint pale streak corkscrewing downward like smoke turning in reverse. The spiral was so small one could mistake it for the candle's shimmer. Elias lowered his eyelids by half a finger's breadth, not to look away but to catch more clearly the movement within the glass's curved face. He heard a knife set down on a plate to the left, heard someone's breath pick up a beat, and heard somewhere deep in his shoulder a string tightening, very fine, very quiet, but impossible to pretend it wasn't there. On the silver tray, the image of the hand had withdrawn like a bird's shadow in passing. No fingerprints, no smudge, only two glasses standing side by side, one of them having just taken into itself something that did not belong to it. The angle of view shifted a notch. The emptied packet was folded briskly in two, the serrated edge tucked inward. The thin, pulpy paper was pinched between two fingers and slid beneath the tablecloth's hem, where the fold made a shadowed slit. The motion was neat, as if learned on a shop floor. Minimize movement, conceal the root. The smell of roast suddenly flattened, yielding to a slight chill, not from the window, but from the thought. Under the table, Max shifted his weight from left paw to right, a claw scraping lightly on the wood with a dry sound, then still. In the glass, the pale, swirling trace had vanished. The wine's surface returned to its prior calm, holding only a slightly deeper red where the candlelight passed. Elias let out a breath as long as the wall clock stepped to its next mark. He did not look at his son, did not adjust his chair, did not reach for the glass. Everything remained as before, only his eyes were different. No longer the look that checks the order of objects, but the look of a man who has seen a very fine crack in the pane, knows it will run when the temperature shifts, yet chooses to note the coordinates before the night changes its wind. A dry pine needle fell from the branch, landed on the tray's rim, slid over the edge to the cloth, leaving a pale green streak like a punctuation mark out of line. Outside on the porch, the newly replaced bulb held steady, a yellow stroke that asked nothing. Inside, the spoon's light chime went on, and on the table, Elias's wine glass sat in its place, the surface flat as if never touched. Only the silver tray, if one bent close, still kept a faint tremor along its metal rim, the last trace of a hand that had passed like a shadow. Max appears in close-up like a dark arrow, its point the eyes, his pupils narrow, a dark brown rim holding a coldness that seems to come from metal rather than flesh. A silver whisker trembles once, very slightly, not from cold, but from a silent calculation. His posture does not change, chin resting on his front paws, long body pressed to the floor, tail still as an old branch. Only the gaze shifts, straight as a hair-fine taut line, running from beneath the table to the air just behind the son's shoulder. The steady porch light pours through the edge of the glass door, sliding a thin line along the bridge of Max's nose and stopping at the corner of his eye, leaving a pinhead of light. In that speck, the son's figure reflects, warped, enough to show knuckles that have just done something that does not belong at the dinner table. Max no longer growls. His larynx is drawn just enough that the sound is only a faint vibration, short as a lightly touched string. The right ear lifts half a centimeter, the left stays put. A lopsided ear set that secretly warns anyone who has learned to read him. Elias does not look at his son. He looks at the wine's surface, already stilled and flat in his glass. The deep red cups the candlelight into a dark halo with a thin blade-like rim of light. He keeps his eyes there, as if keeping a suspect within a chalk circle. His chest tightens, not a spasm, but a slow cinch. Invisible bands notch lightly tighter each time the wall clock slides to a new mark. He tries breathing in to a count of 3, out to a count of 4. The inhale snags halfway and forces a shift to a 2-3 rhythm, shorter, more discreet. The wool collar rubs his neck, making a hot streak that opposes the cold patch creeping along his breast. Close on the hand, the skin of his hand is dried, the knuckles raised, veins running as quiet blue lines. 2 fingers press against the stem of the glass without lifting it. The glass's cold seeps into the finger pad, the needle of sensation spinning back toward the past. To times he has held a glass like this when he needed to mask a wave. Beside the silver tray, the paper napkin he quarter-folded earlier lies still, its crease sharp as a ruler's edge. It is not a weapon, only a precautionary habit of someone used to speaking through clean surfaces. Below, Max breathes more evenly, but each breath has a tiny stop at the bottom, as if he is holding to listen. His muzzle tightens, drawing in air in small measures, sampling the low-lying scents, the warmth of wood, damp wool, and a strange streak of smell, thin as medicinal mist. His eyes do not leave the son's face. Each minute movement of that wrist prints on his pupils like a tremor. At the edge of the frame, the younger child touches the bell, its jingle like a drop of glass falling onto water just frozen, beautiful but cold. Elias shifts his shoulders very slightly, adjusting his seat so his back meets the chair, making the body believe it is being supported. Where the scapula touches fabric, there is a muffled sound, enough for him to hear himself. From deep in his gut, a shard of old resentment flares like embers meeting wind. No flame, only a deeper red. In that brief flash, he feels the cold pleasure of having caught the path of an intention in time, feels the order he has built could become a perfect silent trap. That pleasure passes as quickly as the soft pop of a candle. What remains is a blank ground into which cold floods his tightening chest. The camera pulls back half a beat to show the relations. A golden stripe from the porch laid across the floor, stopping between 2 chairs, the silver tray throwing back a bright patch of ceiling, Martha's photograph holding the room's soft part still. Back to the close-up. Max's eyes pinch 1 more degree, the upper lip ripples a faint line. No teeth, no sound, only a small signal Elias understands. He lowers his eyelids a fraction, enough for Max to receive a wordless scene. The dog loosens his neck, tilts his head by 2 degrees, as if switching from vigilance to remembering. The wine's surface stays flat, seemingly blameless. But at the bottom, where the candlelight doesn't reach, a dark speck has just dilated, then tightened again like a pupil in shadow. Elias keeps counting. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. His thumb on the stem slips a little with a film of sweat. He draws the palm lightly onto the silver tray to reclaim the cold, as one presses a forehead to glass in a dizzy spell. The clock is suddenly louder, not because it has changed tempo, but because he is listening with different ears. The son shifts his chair. A short scrape marks the wood, then stops. Max's eyes follow, but he does not turn his head. His attention is concentrated on those finger joints where something hollow has just been hidden and a gap has just closed. In the dog's eyes, the reflection of that hand breaks into two shards, one light, one dark wavered together by the candle's halo. In that moment, the animal is no longer an animal. It is a yardstick of loyalty drawing an invisible boundary around its master. Elias hears his heart beating higher than usual, near the sternum, like an uninvited guest pounding at the door. He slides his right foot back half a centimeter under the table, finding a firm brace on the floor. The left foot holds, keeping his whole body apparently motionless. Head slightly bowed, eyes still locked to the glass's surface, he accepts a fact. Tonight, the calm he just arranged may serve only one purpose: to throw the wrongness into relief. Meanwhile, Max lies like a dark stone, his eyes two glass drills fixed on a single person. The whole room, with all its warm smells and gentle light, hangs from a soundless cord strung across the table, a cord that has just touched Elias's chest and tightened one more notch. Not agonizing, but exact and unmistakable. The clink of knife and fork on porcelain receded into the background, leaving a thin layer of sound like mist. Elias tilted his wrist, shifted the silver tray by a small angle, not enough for anyone to call it a change of position, just enough for the candlelight to slide and rake obliquely across the glass surface. On the bowl of the glass, where a hand had just passed, there appeared a hazy band, like a smudged moon, arcing lines, thick in places, thin in others, a fingerprint that hadn't yet dispersed into meaninglessness. He held the tray steady at that exact angle. The metal breathed very softly, like a lake just touched by a fingertip. Under the table's edge, in the warm darkness where his knees met the wood, the old camera nestled like a sleeping animal, the soft shutter-release cable threaded through his palm, draped over the chair's edge, hidden beneath a fold of cloth. Elias pressed once, very lightly. Click. The thin sound of the old shutter didn't cut across the meal. It was only like a grain of sand falling into the exact groove of a clock gear, slipping through unheard except by Max, whose right ear rose one notch and then lowered, his eyes flicking toward Elias's knee like a short question already answered. He exhaled through his nose, the length of a second-hand's tick. On the tray, the curved reflection of the room began to retain details in a new order: the bright line along the rim of the glass, the ring mark on the bowl, a tiny mote of dust trapped under the edge of the coaster. Elias turned the tray at another degree, his eyes examining the print the way a carpenter reads grain to see which way the blade should go. The mark sharpened, a faint whorl appearing in the center of the concentric circles, the small landmark of a hand that had just committed an offense against the evening. Click. The second time, quieter than the first, like an inhale hidden in the throat. The old camera had its habits. It opened the shutter half a beat slow and only then closed, enough to gather a little more gold from the porch, a little more red from the wine, a little of Max's black shadow under the table. Elias didn't look down. He remained the host setting dishes, only tilting a shoulder so his body would shield the reflections from sidelong eyes. On the tray, the white paper napkin lay exactly where he had placed it earlier, folded into quarters. Elias lifted it, his fingers smoothing a line along the center, then bending in a strange diagonal crease, forming a small herringbone so only he would understand. The crease wasn't for beauty, it was a silent arrow, pointing the direction of the evidence when things began to tangle. how to set it beside the glass, where to touch without ruining, where to wipe so as to preserve the edge of the empty paper packet that had just vanished beneath the tablecloth. He leaned in slightly, as if to adjust the bowl of green beans. The napkin's edge skimmed past the stem of the glass, stopping before the portion of glass with the faint print. Elias touched one corner of the napkin to the rim of the coaster, not to the bowl of the glass, marking an anchor point, so that if anyone happened to rotate it, he would know. The crease formed a sharp angle aimed at the smudge. From above, it looked like a small decoration, but at the eye level of one who knew, it was a sign. He set the rest of the napkin on the tray's rim, creating a slender bridge between metal and paper. A bridge that could be lifted at any moment to catch what needed keeping. Click. The third time, so faint it blended into the clock's beat. Elias let the release cable fall back into his palm, his index finger holding still one more second before it parted. His chest was still tight. A cold patch crawled across his sternum like a slowly receding tide. But somewhere, a fragile pleasure, cold as freshly honed steel, had slid through. The pleasure of setting a single paving stone into the place it belongs. He let it pass as quickly as it came, not clinging, not swallowing, lest it become a thorn. Max pressed his chin closer against his leg, breathing steadily, eyes never leaving the far side. Elias answered by brushing his knee, as one taps a drum. I'm here. He went on arranging the small things, rotating the handle of the gravy spoon so the fingerprint faced toward him, pulling the bowl of potatoes closer to cover a strange wrinkle in the tablecloth. Each motion carried two layers of meaning, courtesy for the meal and positioning for a piece of truth soon to need a place to stand. He lifted the silver tray half a centimeter, then set it back, aligning it so the candlelight reflected straight into his own glass. At that reflective angle, every line suddenly came clear. The faint print no longer lay in partial shadow. It rose like a bead of dew on glass. Elias tilted his head by exactly 1 degree, enough for his eyes and the lens under the table to look to the same point. Click. The final frame in the short sequence evidence that doesn't shout, only stands still inside the image. The napkin with the herringbone fold he placed back beside the glass, its outer edge flush with the tray's rim. If needed, a light pinch at one corner and it would clamp onto the glass's lip like a soft trap, carrying the trace of touch with it. But for now, it lay still, white, clean, like a precondition for a decent evening. Elias drew his hand back, middle finger tucked inward, and wiped across the table's edge where the release cable had just lain. No trace, no sound, nothing extra. The meal went on with polite motions, spoon against porcelain, bread passing from hand to hand, children's busy chatter. Between those beats, the silver tray sat unmoving at its chosen angle, the old camera motionless in the table's shadow, the oddly folded napkin waiting for its proper task. Elias sat upright, his thumb touching the stem of the glass for a beat as if sealing, then letting go. The wine's surface did not ripple. The porch glow stayed gold, and beneath the carefully laid warmth, another layer of order had been built. So quiet no one sensed it, save for him, the old dog, and the camera that had kept 3 small clicks, enough for some later night to have its own language. Resentment rose like a slab of hot metal lifted from the furnace, screeching past the ribs and lying square on his chest. On the tip of his tongue, a cold iron taste flashed. His throat went 1 notch dry. Elias heard himself clench his teeth tight, a minute sound only someone with an old mouthful of teeth would notice. Everything in the room turned sharp-edged. The rim of the silver tray became a knife, the stem of the glass a nail. The candlelight thinned until it could split the dark in two. The darkest thoughts slid through like a beast loosed from its cage. Just quick enough to imagine swapping the glasses. Just cruel enough to picture justice finding its own way. For a thin instant, the thrill of punishment flared, cold, neat, beautiful as newly honed steel. But under the table, Max lifted his head. No sound, no lunge, only a small movement like a lake rising by an inch, so his eyes could look straight at him. There was no fire in those eyes. They held the steadiness of stone and the clarity of water. The silvered muzzle touched his trouser leg, a very light beat, like someone laying a hand on your shoulder to say, "Stay still." From his throat came not a growl, just a deep, even breath, back and forth like a loom's shuttle, threading through the tangled fibers winding in Elias's chest. Elias kept his hand where it was beside the stem of the glass. His thumb pinched the tray's lip a little and let go, letting the metal's cold draw some heat from his skin. He looked at the glass for a long beat, his gaze passing over the dark red, over the candle's halo swimming on the surface, over the small dark point sunk at the bottom like a grain of sand. The angry cord strung across his chest suddenly slackened a notch, not because it vanished, but because it found a place to hook, the old dog's gaze. He looked at him the way he always did, not asking him to be right, only asking him to be there. That loyalty, stripped down to the bone, suddenly made the beauty of cold justice feel hollow, like an empty can set in the middle of the dinner table. His breath found its rhythm again, in for 3, out for 4, then in for 4, out for 4. With each beat, he let his eyes touch the things already set in their right places. Martha's photograph straight, the molding clean, the herringbone folded napkin lying still, the porch light standing steady. They were like taut strings on an instrument. Pull too hard and the sound would shriek, the room would shatter. Max kept watching, unblinking, like a stake driven midstream. At the edge of his sight, the children whispered by the tree, the crackle of wrapping paper giving the anger a chance to step half a beat back, leaving just enough emptiness for a decision to pass through. The punitive thought, beautiful, cold, bright. He sat down as a craftsman slides a blade back into its sheath. It did not disappear, he simply did not hold it. Instead, he looked to the white napkin with its strange fold, to the camera that had just given 3 small clicks, to the faint whirl on the glass's bowl made plain under the candle. Evidence exists on its own. It needs no extra fire from him. The silence he had built since the evening began. The chairs drawn closer, the polished tray, the renewed bulb on the porch, now became a thin but firm wall to lean against. Standing there, he suddenly saw again the figure in Martha's frame, not a winner, but a keeper of the house. Max set his chin back on his paws, but his eyes did not let him go. That gaze drew Elias back from the brink where the pleasure of revenge waited like a patient salesman. At the table's edge, his fingers stopped trembling. The chair back received his scapula, the body's weight muffling a clock that had grown too loud. He did not hide what he had seen, nor did he parade it. He only let the breath drop down into his belly, let the heartbeat fall out of his throat and return to where a heart belongs. The room, for that, softened by 1 degree none of them could have named. Knife touches plate lightly. The candle rounds its flame. The porch casts a steady glow. Elias turned the tray back toward its original position, just enough that the faint print stayed within his own private line of sight, then laid his hand on the table's edge, throwing his hand's shadow over the camera. The napkin's crease he smoothed with his index finger, sharp and clean. He did not swap the glasses, did not move the evening onto a different script. He chose to let the truth speak in its own hour, like a bell that does not need to be rung early. Max sighed a breath you could hear, spreading evenly across the floorboards, loosening the taut strings stretched across the room. With that look, he had, in the end, signed a new agreement on Elias's behalf. Don't turn tonight into a pit for others to fall into. Make it a sheet of ice thick enough that everyone can see where they are standing. The resentment in Elias's chest drew tight into a small stone, heavy, edged but at rest. He placed that stone into an old man's invisible drawer, the leave it be drawer, where things will be called by their right names with documents, with light, and with a slow sentence at another time. When he lifted his eyes, the silver tracy on the table still shone, the wine in the glass still lay flat, the children still laughed softly among the glass baubles. Only one thing had changed, the decision. It had been moved off the cold cliff edge of payback and set upon the level ground of discipline and loyalty. Under the table, Max half closed his eyes, but kept one ear on watch. Elias gave a slight nod to no one and for no one only, so he himself would know that tonight he would stand on the side of the porch light, shining steady. Elias lifted the glass by 2 fingers at the stem, a neat motion like lifting a seal off the paper. The candlelight rolled along the dark red surface and then came to rest at the lip, forming a thin ring of light. He did not look at his son, but through the space between the 2 chairs, where the porch light's golden bands shone in, slicing the wooden floor into 2 halves. Then he leaned toward the far side of the table and offered the glass across, his hand in perfect balance, his voice low and clear. "Here, you use it." The echo of those 4 words fell, struck nothing, and simply sank into the cloth. The sun froze for half a beat. The hand he'd set on the plate's rim drew back from the line of knife and fork as if afraid of brushing them. His pupils tightened a notch, and on the bowl of the glass he saw a thin haze, a touch mark just visible to anyone who knew to look. His face had no time to arrange an attitude. Neck muscles moved first, eyes after. The corner of his mouth snagged between 2 intentions. A small bell on the tree in the living room rang by itself where a child had just grazed it, stretching into a thread of sound slung over the heads of the 3 adults. Elias held the glass at the distance of a single arm's reach, the distance of an invitation without compulsion. The rim did not tilt, the wine's surface did not spill, only rose like a lake filled to the brim. Under the table, Max raised his head the way Elias's arm pointed, his eyes stopping at the son's wrist, then back to Elias's, then lying still. No growl, no hiss. His silence was like a light tether tied to his master's wrist, a gentle reminder. Don't pull too hard. The son reached to touch the stem, then drew back, then reached again. The edge of a nail grazed the glass with a small ting, enough for Elias to hear, enough for Max to prick an ear. No one moved further. In the candlelight, the red in the glass tightened and loosened in a small ring, like a pupil changing to light. Elias still looked through the gap between the chairs, eyes fixed on the golden strip on the floor, a thin border anyone could step over if they wished. He spoke slowly, as if setting another small stone to keep from slipping. "This is my glass." A second of silence deep as an inkwell. The sun swallowed dryly. His Adam's apple ran up and then down, its shadow trailing along the collar of his sweater. His hand lowered and opened as if it had been holding something hot. He looked at the glass, then at the herringbone folded napkin set beside the tray, the crease pointing straight at the bowl of the glass like a small paper arrow. His eyes slid over the silver tray, where the warped reflection had just managed to capture a movement that had happened. No one spoke further. No need. Inside Elias, the resentment he had just placed in an invisible drawer did not disappear. It lay there, heavy, but no longer hot. He could feel the steel face of punishment brushes his hand as he offered the glass. A cold, neat, beautiful instant, and then slide away like an old blade being sheathed. He heard Max's sigh, long and round, like a forge bellows blowing across coals, keeping the fire just red enough to see the way, not enough to burn the house. Elias kept the glass suspended for another half beat, long enough for the silence to develop meaning, short enough not to turn it into pressure. On the shelf, Martha's photograph caught the porch light into a pale streak on her cheek, as if someone had laid a hand there to say enough with their eyes. At the edge of the rug, the children had bent to pick up fallen pine needles. Their gaze shifted toward the window, peeling away from the adult's table like a brook parting from a river. The son did not take it. His hand stopped a knuckle's length from the stem, then lowered to the tabletop, both palms turned up empty. He blinked slowly, an unhidden motion, like a person acknowledging he had seen what needed seeing. Elias exhaled lightly from the belly and put the glass back exactly where it belonged. The foot met the coaster with a snug, airless fit, not half a millimeter to spare. The faint fingerprint was still there, a little brighter under the chosen angle of reflection. Max's loyalty, His voice ran between his ribs, no louder than a knife touching porcelain. Has changed my point of view. No one answered, but the quiet in the room changed shade, from the taut quiet of string to the heavy quiet of a wet coat hung on a hook, drip by drip emptying. Max set his chin down again, one ear folded halfway, eyes still open. The porch light outside held steady, the golden band between the two chairs firm as a freshly sewn seam. Elias slipped a hand into his breast pocket, drew out a small cloth, and wiped the rim of the glass, not erasing the print, only a bead of wine dew that hadn't yet fallen. The motion was ordinary enough to pass as the habit of a careful old man, but within it was a language clear enough for anyone who needed to understand. He had seen, he chose to keep silent, and he set everything back in place so the truth could walk on its own 2 feet. The wine glass returned before him. The silver tray stood still like dark water. The old camera lay quiet as if asleep. And amid it all, a decision had just been signed without a pen. No one was pushed down, no one raised up by a lie. Only light and silence would do their work, as they had been set to from the beginning of the evening. I used to think loyalty lived only in those who shared my blood, but Max taught me loyalty isn't something you can buy or fake. It is a choice. I thought that sentence in my head before it could turn into sound. Blood is a durable thread, but durable doesn't mean it knows how to keep. For years, I confused two things, habit and loyalty. People can come to dinner because of the calendar, because of manners, because they fear gossip. That is habit. Loyalty is different. It's an old animal lying under the table all day long, enduring the smell of damp wool and scorched butter, just so its eyes can catch mine at the moment I need to keep my hands still. Max isn't kin to me, doesn't carry my surname, won't write me into a will. He only comes when I whistle, lies still when I say, that's enough. Waits by the steps when I change the porch bulb. In his language, loyalty is made of very small verbs. Stay, keep watch, return. No swagger, no demand for reward, no pretending not to see. An old dog knows boundaries. He doesn't bite and he doesn't endorse what isn't right. He chooses to stand with the door, the floorboards, the master whose hand is shaking. That is a daily choice, not a blind instinct. I used to think I had a right to expect loyalty from my son, like a savings account opened the day he learned the word dad. But any savings can be emptied by pride, by vanity, by hands that know how to turn the serrated mouth of a packet so it makes no sound. Loyalty isn't written on a birth certificate. It lies in what one chooses to do when no one is looking. Max saw, I saw, while the rest of the room was busy glittering like holiday baubles. I lowered my eyes to the silver tray, the faint fingerprint, the napkin's herringbone crease, and a thin golden strip from the porch light running between the two chairs. Together, they suddenly formed a clear sentence. Silence can keep the truth, if it stands on the right side. I had wanted to be loyal to anger, because anger promises a justice that is quick, sharp, clean, but that kind of loyalty would send me back to a cold room, shattered glass, downcast eyes, children's voices gone mute. Max did not look at me as at an avenger. He looked at me as at a keeper of the house. And a house needs a keeper of lights more than a man who knocks others down. I relearned the definition, loyalty not to a person, but to the part of me that is straight, loyal to the porch light just replaced, steady, not flickering, loyal to how the chairs are set, close enough to hear, not so close as to press, loyal to paper and glass, letting the trace of touch speak for itself, neither buried nor flaunted, loyal to a low voice, saying little but in the right measure. Those things can't be bought in a shop, can't be borrowed from anyone. They can only be chosen and paid for with time. I looked toward my son not to scrutinize, but to register the distance. That distance lay plain on the wood, the golden line between the two chairs. Maybe tonight he was loyal to something else. Pride, fear, or some whisper that doesn't belong to me. I cannot trade that loyalty with wine, with gifts, with threats. What I can do is be loyal to the way I want to walk, slow, with a straight back, letting evidence speak, letting kindness be the key, letting enough be enough for the hearer to understand. Max breathed evenly, long strokes. Each time I nearly slipped toward the cold bank of punishment, that breathing pulled me back to ground. I saw the icy thrill, clearly beautiful as a newly honed blade, and I saw how hollow it was beside those old brown eyes. Max's loyalty does not cover for me, and it does not punish anyone on my behalf. It only keeps me from betraying the quiet I spent all autumn building. The bulb replaced, the molding dusted, the silver tray bright, the dinner warm enough. I don't know what name I'll have to give this tomorrow. It might be a report, a printed photograph, an invitation to sit down in another room with brighter light. But tonight, in my small room, I choose to stand where Max stands, on the side of the choice that makes no noise. I draw my breath down into my belly, let the chest stop tightening, set the glass back on its coaster, keep the napkin's crease true. If something needs to speak, it will do so in the light, with no one raising the pitch. Loyalty, it turns out, doesn't ask for applause. It needs a chair set in the right place, a golden strip standing steady, an old dog keeping watch under the table, and a man willing to look straight at his own glass without lying to himself. From there, the other parts will find their places. I hear the clock beat, hear the little girl by the Christmas tree giggle, hear Max breathing evenly. I understand. Tonight, I don't defeat anyone. I simply don't betray myself. And in that small portion, this house will be warm enough to make it through another winter. Elias set the glass down in the middle of the table, exactly in the thin halo where the candlelight and the porch light met. The foot fit snugly into the coaster, making a small, keen keet like a seal pressed onto paper. He rotated the glass half a turn, not hurried, not showy, so the faint whirl on the bowl aligned with the reflection angle from the silver tray. The blur came up and then held like dew settled on morning glass. The paper napkin folded in a herringbone lay beside it, the pointed fold aimed at the bowl, looking like a paper arrow only those in the house would understand. No one lifted a utensil. The children's sounds on the rug thinned, giving way to a silence thicker than usual, the kind that lets you hear a candle pop a bit of wick, the clock touch a new mark, and the last drop fall from the hem of a coat hanging to dry. Under the table, Max raised his muzzle, then set his chin on his paws, eyes open just enough to look through the space between the two chairs. On the shelf, Martha's face in the photograph caught a streak of porch light, the corner of her mouth brightening by half a tone, as if someone had just laid a hand there. Elias did not look at anyone longer than a beat. He set his fingers on the edge of the table as if finding a tempo, then spoke, his voice low enough to hear, like reading an old note. Back then, by the timber dock, he had a friend on the same shift, a man who knew how to tighten a bolt and how to smile. They stood through many winters together, shared an old coffee thermos, and thought the nods on a porch were binding enough for a life. Until one evening, also winter, same smell of damp wool and wind and rain, the things presumed to be ours left the house in a familiar pair of hands. On the table then, there was no silver tray, no candle, only a fresh greasy fingerprint line on a cheap ring binder cover. He spoke slowly, as if putting each thing back in its place. People can get used to standing side by side, used to calling each other by name at the workers' diner, but not every habit is loyalty. That year, he lost a sum of money, not large, but he lost a quiet it took many years to piece back together. He carried his anger a very long way, so long he understood that anger is a sharp knife. The more finely you hone it, the more beautiful it seems, but the blade will split even what ought to be laid whole on the table. Then he chose to speak by paper, by hours and minutes, by the testimony of inanimate things, and the house kept just enough quiet to make it through January. He paused, his gaze sliding over the faint whirl on the glass, then the napkin's pointed fold, then back to Martha's photograph. His right hand smoothed the edge of the tablecloth, like feeling the grain before a cut. The room settled to that rhythm. The daughter-in-law laid her spoon down softly, kept her palms in her lap, her eyes somewhere between the glass and the tree. The son was motionless, head slightly bowed, the shadow of his sweater collar making a dark furrow on his chest. No proper names were spoken. No shoulders were pointed at. Only the glass lay in the middle. And the story took the long way around, so that by the end, whoever needed to hear would know for themselves which side of the golden strip on the floor they were sitting on. Elias exhaled a long breath, making the candle's surface tremble half a beat and then steady. He set his hand on the chair back as if leaning against a milestone, then lifted his eyes and let the sentence that needed saying fall onto the table, light but distinctly heavy. Anger will ruin what needs to be said plainly, but forgiveness, it can heal the wound. The sound of that sentence did not rise. It soaked into the wood, into the glass, into the air that was both warm and cool. Max shifted by an inch enough that the tap of a nail on the floor sounded like a period. Outside, the porch light still stood steady, drawing a straight golden stripe between the two chairs. Inside, the old camera lay quiet under the table's edge, like a witness who no longer needs to speak. Elias turned the glass one more degree, then let it be. Everything was in its place. The print, the crease, the light, and a sentence that did not need to be said a second time. The rest he left to the room, and to those in it to hear their own share. Elias gave a very low, soft whistle. Max rose from the shadow under the table, like a moving warm mass, stepped around the chair's edge, and came to his side. The dog's paw on the wooden floor made no more than a soft touch of sound. Elias looked at no one but the old animal. He reached down, palm open, to let Max rest his head there, a weight just enough to pull his heart back from the cold edge of the thought he'd just had. He looked up and pointed a finger toward the glass lying in the candle's halo. Enough. The two words fell onto the table like a small pebble, not breaking the surface, but enough for quiet rings to spread. No one breathed harder. No knife or fork struck another. Only a new, heavier silence settled over the wood. The glass was still there, the foot snug on the coaster, the bowl's faint whirl clearly visible at the preset angle of light. Under the tablecloth's edge, the lip of an empty powder packet poked out in a tiny, serrated line. Like the corner of an envelope someone had forgotten to hide well. Elias did not touch them. He did not cover them either. Everything was left as it was, like a sentence not yet needing to be read aloud. On the silver tray, the room's warped reflection held the order already arranged: candle, glass, napkin folded in a herringbone, and a dark patch where the old camera lay still as if asleep. Max stood beside him, head slightly lowered, eyes cutting to the glass and back to his face, as if waiting for further command. Perhaps if he spoke a different word, this room would become another room, but he said nothing more. He set his hand on Max's back and stroked a long line from the nape to the mid-spine, slowly, letting the warmth seep through his own skin, quenching the last live ember in his chest. The sun did not reach out. The corner of his mouth tightened and then released. His wrists lay upturned on the tabletop, bare and exposed, as if they themselves acknowledged what had just passed. The daughter-in-law blinked slowly, her hands laced beneath the table's edge. Her gaze stopped at the oddly folded napkin, then slid to Martha's photograph. On the rug, the children went on with their game among fallen pine needles. The rustle of wrapping paper drew the air back to a warmer layer, like a thin blanket laid over the adults' shoulders. Elias slid the tray back by exactly half a degree, so the candlelight no longer pressed on the fingerprint not to hide it, but to let the room breathe evenly again. He offered a glass of water to his son instead of wine, without a word. He took it, his wrist trembling for the smallest beat, then settling. Max lay back in his old spot, chin on his paws, ears folded halfway, eyes still open, a gatekeeper who needs no gate. Outside on the porch, the newly replaced bulb stood steady, pulling that golden strip a little farther across the floor, scoring a fine line between the two chairs, a boundary no one is forced to cross. Inside, the candle leapt less. The flame kept the shape of a drop of water. Elias touched his forefinger to the edge of the herringbone fold, sharpening the crease, a small gesture like signing his name on the frame of the truth. Then he drew his hand back, leaving the napkin where it was, the pointed fold still aimed at the bowl like a silent arrow. Anger, when not flung outward, does not disappear. It remains inside like a stone that warms, edged but no longer cutting. Elias set that stone into the invisible drawer of a man who has lived long with wood, the drawer labeled, "Let the evidence speak later." Tonight, no one was forced to drink, no one was named. There was only a short sentence that shut the door just ajar to violence. Enough. And that sentence, thanks to the dog's loyal eyes, changed the course of the entire dinner. He poured more water for the children, passed the bread basket to his daughter-in-law, and spooned a helping of potatoes into his own bowl. Ordinary gestures returned, but the room remembered one thing clearly. The glass and the packet were still there, untouched. They became silent exhibits, not weapons. Max sighed softly. That breath rolled under the table like a small wave, slackening the invisible cord strung tight since the start of the evening. At the edge of the frame, Martha's photograph threw the porch light back as a pale streak on her cheek. Everything held its place, and the rest, the necessary speaking, would arrive by light and paper, not by an act of payback in the night. Night dropped like a thick blanket. On the porch, the newly replaced bulb stood steady, laying a thin, golden strip across the door glass and letting it lie still on the wooden floor. Inside, the smell of butter and thyme had faded, giving way to the warm steam at the sink. In the kitchen, the tap was open to just a thread. Elias took a glass, the one not on the silver tray, and turned it under the stream. The glass surface was cold at first, then warmed under his hand. The thin rim of wine at the mouth washed away, leaving beads of water clinging in round chains like little glass pearls, sliding slowly down the bowl. He did not hurry. Each rotation was even, his thumb circling the stem as if drawing an invisible ring. The glass touching lightly against the sink made a sound like a spoon against a cup from a very distant kitchen. A dishcloth hung over the back of the kitchen chair. Elias took it down, draped it across his hand, and blotted drop by drop, the cloth's tip gliding along the bowl, making so fine a hiss that only the kitchen and he could hear it. He held the glass up to a light source, turned it, checked. The clear surface returned the porch and the molding like a dustless miniature photograph. A warm breath fogged the glass for a beat, then cleared. He wiped once more lightly. The cabinet's glass door opened. Its oiled hinge made no sound. On the third notch, a faint ring, left by the years, where the glass's foot had long rested, showed beneath the clear varnish. Elias slid the glass in and set it down exactly. The foot touched the varnished wood with a very small sound. Snug. He stepped back half a pace and looked through the glass. The glass stood alone in the row, brighter for just being polished, like a stray star in an old constellation. The front room kept its order. On the table, the other glass still sat in the place between the candle's halo and the porch light, its bowl holding the faint whirl no one had touched. The edge of an empty powder packet showed under the tablecloth's fold, a tiny serrated line, like a note someone had forgotten to erase. The paper napkin, folded in a herringbone, lay still, its pointed fold still aimed at the bowl. The old camera slept under the table's edge, the leather strap breathing a long beat along with the wood. Elias dimmed the kitchen lights, leaving a small lamp on the shelf. The gold slid along the cabinet's side, rolled over the rug, and joined the porch's strip into a single calm plane. He walked slowly to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat. His back was straight without bracing, the straightness of a man who has set something heavy in the right place. His shoulders dropped half a beat, enough for the breath to go deep. Max left the shadow under the table, stepped out, and laid his head on Elias's knee. That weight did not ask. It simply came to rest. The old dog's breathing was steady, warm, threading through the trouser cloth like an underground stream running through earth. Elias set his palm on the dog's back and stroked from nape to mid-spine once, then once again. The silver hairs brushed under his hand, rising and falling with the breath like rafts of grass drifting past a riverbank, quiet enough to hear crickets. The room drew in its borders. The candle tightened its flame into a still droplet. The wooden-cased clock beat without haste. On the photo shelf, Martha in her silver frame caught a thin streak of porch light on her cheek. On the floor, a few fallen pine needles lay scattered, no small shoes running past anymore. The coat hung quiet at the door, the last drop on its hem just fallen. Elias set his other hand on the table's edge, his fingertip tracing an invisible circle around the empty coaster. There was no sentence that needed to be spoken. The glass just washed was back on the shelf. The glass on the table was still there, like a chapter not yet turned. Between those two states there was a narrow passage. He sat squarely in that passage, not leaning either way. The light did not tremble, and the cold in his chest eased into a small stone warm enough to hold. Max shifted, wedging closer against his shin. His eyelids lowered, but one ear kept watch halfway. Elias nodded lightly, meant for no one but the animal lying close. The water in the kettle had cooled, but the house kept a soft warmth. The warmth of things returned to their places, of a freshly cleaned glass standing in the cupboard, of an old dog's breath laying down the night's baseline. Outside on the porch, the light stood steady like a promise that needs no words. Inside, the chair held his back firm, without a creak. He sat upright, his eyes passing over the familiar surfaces. Silver tray, folded napkin, glass rim, photograph. No blade flashed at the edge of thought now, only enough light to see the way to the bedroom. Loyalty, simple as Max's head resting on his leg, and forgiveness without a name. Light as his hand had just been on the dog's back, had pulled the night back from the edge. The house drew in a long breath, then let it out evenly. On the cupboard's third shelf, the glass he had just washed still stood in its old place, like a small, round period closing the evening. This Christmas, I don't have to salvage anything. I only need to believe in healing, and I believe in the loyalty of a dog that taught me the most precious lesson of my life. I said that sentence in my head while the porch light stood steady like a small pledge. The whole house breathed slowly. The silver tray was still. The napkin folded in a herringbone lay quiet. The glass with the touch mark remained where it should be, held by the candlelight, not pushed away by anyone. On many nights like this, inanimate things understand their work better than people do. It turns out that to keep an evening from breaking, you only need not to add unnecessary noise. The rest, time will fill the cracks with a transparent glue called patience. I've lived through many winters trying to repair things, chasing after late apologies, bending words so someone wouldn't be ashamed, throwing up a makeshift bridge with overfilled glasses of wine. Every time the bridge broke in the middle for lack of a pier. Tonight, I build no bridge. I set the chair straight, keep the light steady, let the evidence lie in its place, then step back half a pace. There is a peace that comes from stopping the forcing, a peace that isn't loud, only loosens the straps around the chest. Healing, if it had a shape, would probably look like the way I just washed a glass and returned it to the cupboard's third shelf, cleaned, held to the light, set on its old faint ring, the door closed without making the hinge cry. Not every stain is on the outside. Sometimes what needs washing is the urge to beat someone just for the satisfaction. I washed that part by laying my hand on Max's back and listening to him breathe, a steady rhythm that smooths the small waves in my chest. No promises, no oaths, only an old dog looking straight at me, saying with his eyes, "Stay." I used to think loyalty was a rope braided from blood, binding like law. But Max stands somewhere else. He is loyal to the house, to the light, to the one who turns the key in the morning and oils the hinges at night. He doesn't ask first whether I'm right or wrong. He doesn't stand with any explanation. He simply chooses not to leave his post. Tonight, when my hand almost slipped toward the cold edge of punishment, it was that head nudging my knee that pulled me back. I'm grateful to him as to a milestone in a foggy night. Not only to know the way, but to know I haven't strayed. I believe in healing, not because of some easy reconciliation, but because the small things have returned to their places. The porch bulb has stopped flickering, the step has stopped creaking, the old camera made its click when needed and fell silent at the right time. The paper napkin folded neatly, like a whisper that the truth can speak without hurting more. If tomorrow I must name what happened, I still have paper, I still have photographs, I still have light. But tonight, The house needs quiet. The children are asleep, the coats have dried, and the glass on the table is intact like a chapter not yet turned. To trust in Max's loyalty is to trust the straight part within myself, the part that chooses not to betray the room I've worked so hard to set in order. I think of Martha in the silver frame, the corner of her mouth catching a thin line of porch light like a nod. I tell myself, the keeper of a house doesn't need to defeat anyone, only to keep the light from going out. Tomorrow may be busy, heavy with paperwork, but tonight, all I have to do is sit upright, keep enough quiet to hear the clock strike and hear Max breathe. This Christmas, I'm not patching what lies beyond my reach. I set a clean glass back in its old place, leave another as a reminder, draw the chairs just close enough, and keep an enough at a volume that startles no one. If healing needs a place to dwell, it will dwell in those gestures. And if loyalty needs another name, perhaps it is to stay with the straight part of oneself, with the porch light standing steady, with the warm scent of wood, and with the even breath of a dog who has chosen to guard this house through all the winters that remain. In the end, no one wins by being the loudest. There is only the porch light standing still, the glass with the touch mark lying as it was under the candlelight, the camera sleeping quietly, and Max curled beneath the chair like a gentle guard. If we have to call it revenge, then here it is, the way a grown person lays down a boundary, lightly but firmly, to keep the truth in its proper place, to let silence stay in the right part of silence, to let loyalty pull anger back from the edge. The rest, leave to time. If you've ever walked through a night like that, between anger and the straight part of yourself, leave in the comments a single detail, one thing you put back where it belongs, a small gesture, or just the two words, enough. No need to tell it all. A single sign is enough for those who've been through it to recognize one another. And if you like, tell me where you're watching from, what time it is now, and whether the light in your home is standing steady tonight.